Okay, now I'm recording. Okay, what I want to do tonight, I've got a PowerPoint, and it's just going to kind of walk us through a few things and talk a little bit about where we are with our and why don't y'all go ahead and mute now, okay? Everybody mute so that we don't get any feedback. And if you've got a question, feel free to unmute and we'll discuss it. I'm going to talk a little bit about what where we are with our assignments and what we have going this week. I'll talk about the choice assignment that we have for next week, and that's not due this week, it's due next week. We don't have, well, I'll talk about what we have due this week. We'll talk a little bit about the discussion that we had for this week, and let's see, then a little bit about the chapters that we have for this week. So I'm going to share my screen now, and I think the first thing I'll share is the PowerPoint. So let's see. Y'all let me know, shake your heads if you can see that, or give me a thumbs up if you can see the PowerPoint. Can everybody see the PowerPoint? Good deal. Okay. So this week, what we have for assignments this week, the discussion board, which I opened up yesterday. We're going to discuss the choice assignment, and then you have the quiz that you can begin taking tomorrow after our discussion tonight. Those that were on last week got the message that I extended our due dates until yesterday. And if you didn't get in on the webinar last week, hopefully you deduced that due dates were extended because of the fact that some people didn't get their textbooks yet, and we had kind of an irregular time with, usually the first unit is usually the first week is a short week, and then unit 1 comes with the second long week. And because of our start date this time, it didn't fall that way, so I decided to give you a few extra days to finish that first unit. And so you did have a couple of extra days for that. And so you may not have finished quiz 1 until yesterday. You may have taken it earlier in the weekend, and that's okay too. However you finish that is okay. But you had a little bit extra time, and I also decided not to penalize you if you didn't do all of the discussion in those first couple of days. You had a little more time to do your discussion. So this week we're onto a regular schedule with your discussion board, where you need to have done your first discussion post by the end of the day today, and then you've got the next few days to add your subsequent discussion posts. And then your quiz you'll be able to take here in the next few days between now and the weekend. And then we'll just talk about the choice assignment, which comes next week. But you don't have another assignment or anything due this week. As I discussed with you last week, what you do have is kind of an every other week arrangement. And those of you who have looked at the syllabus have deduced that by now, that you have a week on and a week off with those activities. And then you have another week where you have something else to do. So no activity this week, but next week you'll have to work on your choice assignment. And you'll also have, let's see, the choice assignment isn't due till the next week. It opens up next week, and then it's due the following week. And you do have an activity due next week. So we'll start talking about the choice assignment now, and then next week you'll need to tell me which choice assignment you pick, and then it's due the next week. But you do have an activity due next week. So this is kind of the way the layout is this week and next week. And I'll post this PowerPoint as well, so you can look at it at your leisure later on. So let's talk a little bit about the chapters that we had to discuss. The 3 chapters this week are chapters 4, 5, and 6. And chapter 4 is working with families of children who have disabilities, collaborating with parents, families, and those cultural differences that we have. And then chapter 5 is planning instructional programs. And then chapter 6 is determining some instructional goals. And so the videos that I chose for you this week look at some of each of those kinds of issues. I have a couple of videos that I chose for you to do with having to do with instructional issues. And I wanted you to discuss those on the discussion board. Some having to do with collaboration. The one that I thought was kind of interesting, well, I think they're all interesting or I wouldn't have picked them, but the one about the mom talking about her child with a disability and how she interacts with the school. I like that one because most of us who are present right now are on the school end of that equation. Some of you may have children in your families, either you're the parent of or you're the member of a larger family with children with disabilities, but most of us are working from the angle of educator without that benefit of the parent role. Now, like I said, some of us may have the dual role of educator and parent, but most of us serve in just one of those roles. We have had the benefit in the special education program at Tarleton of having a number of people who serve in both of those roles, a number of people who are educator and parent of child with a disability. And I think those folks are uniquely placed in our midst to talk to us about the duality of that role. If you are the parent of a child with a disability, you're in a very unique position to be an educator as well. And I know that we had a woman a couple of years ago who was the parent of a child with a very significant disability. And in fact, her child had passed away from that disability. And she had dealt with educators who had been, I think many of them had been very unfeeling to her. Her child would have fallen into this category of a child with a significant developmental disability. And she actually took this class 2 or 3 years ago. And it was quite appalling to hear some of the things that she had to say about the way educators had dealt with her and her family as they walked along this path of dealing with a child who had really significant debilitating health concerns and educational needs that were really pretty unusual at times. And she gave me a lot of things to think about from an educator's standpoint, because I have not been the parent of a child with a significant disability. And I really had to stop and think sometimes as she related certain situations she had experienced about the way educators can be less than sensitive sometimes, less than feeling. So I think it's important that that we take into consideration repeatedly how parents really feel. It's not unlike the grief cycle that people go through when they've lost a loved one, when they come to terms with a disability. They go through each of those phases that people go through when they're experiencing a loss of any kind. That they confront the disability, they go through the shock, the denial, the disbelief. Then they go through some adjustment phases. They experience anger, guilt, depression, sometimes shame, and then eventually they adapt. They come to some degree of acceptance. Now, I have worked with lots of families in my, I guess about 40 years now in special education. And I have dealt with some families who I don't think had ever reached the the phase of acceptance. So turn on your mics for a second and let's talk about that. Do you feel like you've, in your careers, have you dealt with families who are at varying stages here, and maybe even if they have an older child, have not come to the point of acceptance? Anybody?
Well, I'm going to kind of put it on the end of having ID students in with inclusion teachers or inclusion classes, because I always did inclusion.
Okay.
And so we would have ID students come in, you know, usually with an aide, and have very, very modified curriculum. And but then we would go to an ARD, and the parent would say, well, they love auto tech, we want them to go to TSTC. And or we want them, so like there was this denial of what the future looked like for their child.
Okay.
And as a teacher, I always wondered whose responsibility it was for like a little reality check. But most ARDs I sat in, honestly, the reality check never came. They were like, well, we will look into that, and we'll look into, or like, I want my child to join the Army. That's not gonna happen. I leave a lot of, even with a lot of my inclusion kids, you know, we had to have that conversation, but usually with the child, it was a little easier to, you know, but I was amazed, and as an art facilitator, I was amazed at how many students, parents with students with very, you know, and not like severe disabilities where they know their child's going to need care, but definitely an intellectual disability where they're always going to need, you know, a job that even requires assistance, and you know, assistance the rest of their life. But how the parents didn't quite see, you know, possibly some of the limitations society is going to put on them, but it's on all of us, you know, actually.
Well, you bring up a really good question there, Teresa, and that is, who is responsible for the quote unquote reality check? That's a great question, and I'm not sure that we have delineated that in schools as to who is responsible for the reality check. Anybody have any feelings about that? Who's responsible, or are we responsible in the schools for the reality check, or is that something that's just not in our purview? Anybody?
Well, you know, our book talks about preparing them, and my book is digital, and this is where a digital book falls into play. Yeah. But it talks, you know, it talks about helping them in self-determining, knowing their weaknesses and their strengths. And if in order to be, in order for them to self-advocate, and they have to know their weaknesses and their strengths, a little, I mean, I thought of that when I was reading that passage about identifying weaknesses and strengths, and sometimes, you know, at those big meetings when everyone's around the table, you know, I have seen times where people have tippy-toed around the weaknesses when it comes to transition planning, when it comes to like, what's your life gonna look after you leave us? And, but I think if we're gonna help that child be successful, at some point we have to look at their strengths and say, you know, hey, what about this instead, or something? And so, I mean, you know, I don't think it has to be like a brutal reality check. It can be tender and loving, you know, but, you know, put in a good direction and such. Honestly, when our, it's like the Health and Human Services Department that comes to the transition meetings. That's not the right name of it. I can't think of the department. One of the life skills teachers, sometimes they are better at like kind of letting the parents know, like being a little firmer with the parents, going, well, you know, in order to, like, your child's not on the right degree plan in order to go to Tarleton, and so therefore, and I've noticed they sometimes feel more comfortable about being a little bit more realistic.
Yeah. Anybody else?
Tagging on to what Teresa said, I just had a student that aged out, and I only had him for 2 years just because that's when I started with Stephenville and I was in Fort Worth before. But thinking about what Teresa was saying, how to, you know, be that person to just kind of nudge it, you know, still talk about the strengths and weaknesses, everything. But my parent even told me that she's never had a teacher be professionally direct. And So, and I try to tell her, well, it's not something that that it's just not in my personality that I tiptoe around. I want to make sure that this student is doing the best that he can with everything. I want to talk about his strengths and his weaknesses, because I'm the type that I want to make sure that I can get him where he needs to be, especially when he ages out now. And so, but she even told me that she went through these phases, and that she never considered her child to be in a life skills setting up until high school. And then once he got into high school, she was in denial for the longest time. She's like, no, my child doesn't need to be in there. No, I understand he's different, but there's nothing wrong, and she would freak out. But then she said that after his sophomore year, she actually accepted everything. And she saw that, yes, he needed all that help that he can get. Yes, he's able to go into gen ed classes with support, but it needs to be like highly structured support. But it was crazy to hear, though, that she's never had a teacher that just kind of tells her how it is in a way, and to help her with that. And so it kind of made me feel good in a way to know that, okay, well, I can actually be here for that parent and say, hey, this is what I think is best, but give me your opinion. Let's work together and let's see what we can do for your child.
Do you think that teachers are afraid?
Oh, I do, definitely. Because this is also a parent that also doesn't hold back. And so she's the type that'll be like, no, there's nothing wrong with my child. I want this, this, and this. Well, that's great. You can have all that, whatever you want, but let's also try this. And so I think it made her feel good that, yes, we're going to work on everything that she wants her child to learn, but then add a little bit more. Or, suggest a few things to change. You're not necessarily taking away her wants and needs, but you're just changing it up a little bit. So I believe that there were teachers that were scared.
I can say it is scary. Now, of course, I've only ever worked with the younger ones, and the majority of my kids were autistic, but even with that, I had parents who didn't even agree with just the autism code label on them, and that was very hard for them. And I had a lot of outspoken parents, like Rebecca was talking about, and the same thing that Teresa was talking about. Sometimes you just have to explain it and try to support them, but make sure that they understand it may not be exactly what you want, but this is what's best for them. And try to make sure that they get that balance of, yes, I care about your child and I care about what you want for them, but from the standpoint that we're looking at specifically for your child, this is what they need. This is what's best, even though it's not what you would typically think of. And I had that problem a lot.
Yeah.
I deal with something kind of similar I'm in an elementary, and I have a diagnostician, one that is like, make the parents cry, make sure they understand if there's an autism diagnosis, and another one that's able to manage it in a way that parents can really accept it and kind of process it, knowing it's a lot of the initial R's in the beginning of this learning. But I've seen it done in both ways. And even with some really good like input and very clear direction of what their child is kind of facing, I feel like there is still a way to do that reality check in a compassionate way, especially depending on the age level. It looks a lot different when you have a 4-year-old with a diagnosis or an 18-year-old. You're preparing them for life and what's next. So
yeah, I agree. Thank you all for your input. Good discussion. Okay, we've got this resilience model that's, I believe this is discussed in your textbook, where we've got stage 1 where we identify the disability, then we have some self-education, then some reflection about self and family, then we get to the stage of advocacy and empowerment, and then appreciation and enlightenment. And of course, this is ideal for everyone. Not everyone is going to be able to reach this stage of appreciation and enlightenment, but that would certainly be ideal and something to shoot for. So if we can help parents access a model like this and work through these stages, that's going to be the best case for parents, and certainly for their children as well. So some common challenges confronting family members. For the parents, well, we've got the challenge of, hang on. Self-education, advocacy, parents actually learning how to advocate for themselves and their children, and planning for the future of their kiddos, and then helping their children learn about peer rejection. And then the siblings. I think this is a group that often gets overlooked in the whole equation, but they're key in the whole framework of the family. They're going to suffer with less parental time and attention. Sometimes there's a lot of jealousy. There's certainly added responsibility. And we don't like to talk about this factor, but there's sometimes some embarrassment by having a sibling who has a disability and maybe acts out in public, other kinds of behaviors that may be embarrassing to the student, and may cause other kids to ridicule or taunt them. And so I think we often forget about the siblings and the impact that a disability has on the children who are not disabled in the family. So how can we as educators effectively partner with parents? Any ideas on this one?
I think it all starts with, at the very beginning, just going ahead and making or building that relationship and communicating with them on everything that you feel, you know, or that you know is going to be right for this next year. Like, and I always tell my parents, you know, let's just give it this year. Let's not, I understand you want to talk about the future, or sometimes you want to bring up the past, but let's just kind of live in the moment and let's talk about, you know, what we want for your child during this school year. And yes, I'll be there the next school year, or there, you know, whoever it is, then we'll move on. But I think it's just great to go ahead and communicate before the school year starts and everything, and just get a head start on everything and build that relationship from the beginning.
Well, that's great advice. I like that. Living in the moment with what's going on right now. I think you're so right, Rebecca, that a lot of families get into meetings with school personnel and they bring up past hurts, past offenses, things like that, and we have a hard time living in the present with the moment and moving forward. And that's great advice. I think another thing that we can do with parents is to be on equal footing with them. I think what alienates a lot of families is when we try to be certainly we are experts in some ways, in many ways, but we sometimes discount the level of expertise that families bring to the table. And I think it's always best to acknowledge that parents are the experts about their kids. They're the ones who have known them from the beginning, who live with them day and night. And when we acknowledge that parents are the experts about their kids, they're the ones who know them better than anybody else, then we level that playing field somewhat, and we give them a lot of credibility, and it makes them more willing to work together with school personnel when we acknowledge their level of expertise. And I think that's one thing that we can do to effectively partner with them. Give them some credibility. So there are some barriers here to effective communication. And certainly these apply to any communicative relationship that we have. So not just that with parents of children with disabilities, but with any relationship within the school, even within our with our relationship with our spouses or our friends, anybody. You could apply these concepts there. But when we have an unequal relationship, and I think this is kind of where I'm headed with the last remark I made about, leveling that playing field and acknowledging parents' expertise. When there's this real disparity in the relationship, I'm more of an expert than you are, or I've got the upper hand. That inequality in a relationship doesn't make for good communication. Miscommunication, when we don't understand each other and we're not real eager to make sure that we do understand each other. That can be a barrier. Differing styles of communication. I think my husband and I of 20 years still struggle with this. We struggle with this a lot still. Differing styles of communication. I am an over communicator and he is an under communicator. But that may be kind of men in general. But he does a lot of nonverbal communication, and I do a lot of over verbal communication. And so we often have miscommunication based upon our differing styles. Different agendas. Now, this happens a lot between parents and schools. The parents want us to know one thing about their children, and we've got a whole different agenda of what we have in mind is important, what parents think is important, and what we think is important. Very different. And then we have the whole issue of culture and what's culturally different between schools and families. I remember a few years ago when I was a school administrator in a district, we had a child who was recommended for special education and was considered by her kindergarten teacher to be very, very disruptive in the classroom, and would not sit down, would not do as the teacher told her in the kindergarten classroom, and continually took her shoes off and would not put them back on when the teacher told her to, this kind of thing. And the parents came to my office and said they were very upset that she was being recommended for special education, and invited me and the coordinator to their home. Well, we went to their home. They were recent immigrants from a country in Africa. And when we walked in the door of their apartment, the whole family was there to greet us. It was a very big deal that school administrators had come to their home. But the first thing we were asked to do when we walked in the door, was to take off our shoes. And so it was a cultural issue to remove shoes. And the child was being asked in the classroom to sit on the carpet in kindergarten. Well, she took off her shoes before she got on that carpet. And that was a cultural issue. She wouldn't get on that carpet with her shoes on. And the kindergarten teacher hadn't made that connection. We came into the house and there were only 2 chairs in the house. And the family asked us to sit in them. They all sat on the floor. And they offered us something to eat, and there were no utensils. There was just a bowl with some food, and they wanted us to eat it with our fingers, because this is what they did where they were from. They all sat on the floor in a circle. They ate with their hands, and this was culturally appropriate. But when the child came to school and did some of these same kinds of things, she was said to be very maturationally immature, some of these kinds of things. So the school didn't understand what was going on culturally. The mother began showing us all the things that the child could do in the home setting. She knew all of her letters of her alphabet. She knew all of her numbers, a number of these kinds of things. but it wasn't transferring to the school setting because there was such a disconnect between the teacher and the child in a cultural way. I don't think I've ever seen cultural differences impact a child's education so dramatically, so that she was being recommended for special education when you got right down to it, there was no disability. It was a difference in culture. And the next thing we did was remove that child from that particular kindergarten teacher's class and place her in a different class. And you'd be surprised, the need for special education disappeared. So we've all seen these kinds of things about making positive word choices when communicating. I think these are kind of a no-brainer. Things that you avoid when you're talking about children. We don't want to use words like troublemaker, unprepared, poor worker, lazy. He's a behavior problem. We use a different set of words to talk about children, and this puts us in a better place when we're communicating with families. Rather than he's a troublemaker, he's disturbing the class. You know, put it in more of a behavioral term rather than a label. He comes to class without supplies, doesn't complete assignments. He requires multiple reminders, things like this that are more behavioral in their description rather than those labels. Now, as I said to you all last week, those of you who were on last week, I said that what we're working toward in the master's program is moving everybody to the next stage of your career. If you're a teacher now, you want to be moving toward either being an expert teacher, or if you're an instructional specialist now, moving to administration, or if you're an administrator now, moving to whatever the next phase is in your career. A master's program or a certification program should be moving you on to that next stage in your career. So if you look at this slide and you say, well, I know all of that, that's what teachers already know, then you need to look at that with the lens of, how can I use something like this in the next phase of my career? Well, you would use something like this to help teachers that you're going to be assisting in that next phase. So if you're training to be a diagnostician, how would you incorporate that into a report that's going to assist a teacher whose student doesn't qualify for special education? How can you incorporate some of those recommendations there on the right-hand side for a teacher who's going to be going back to the classroom with a child who doesn't qualify for special education? So person-centered planning. This is a phrase that you'll be hearing off and on the whole semester that we work together about students with significant disabilities. We want to always include that person in the planning that we do for them. And you saw some examples of that in the videos that we've looked at last week and this week. How we incorporate those individuals into what we're saying about them, so that we're not talking so much about them, but we're talking with them about the planning that we're doing for them. And so here are a couple of systems that we would use in school settings to help with that. One is the McGill Action Planning System, and another is what we call the COACH method. And it's the acronym is for Choosing Options and Accommodations for Children. And you'll see more about those in your textbook. Well, let's talk a little bit about instructional goals. How do we make instructional goals for students who have significant disabilities? This has changed a lot over the last 40 years since special education was born. And we do that by examining some of these surveys and scales and other kinds of things that we look at to help us see what's going on with the student. We're going to look at adaptive behavior skills for any student who has an intellectual disability. Now, those of you who have already gone through some of the tests, some of the courses for the diagnostician program know that adaptive behavior skills are a key component for any intellectual disability assessment that you do. And those of you who are going to be doing that in the near future will learn that in the fall and spring semesters that you have coming up. Adaptive behavior scales are key components of any intellectual evaluation that you do for a child who's suspected of having an intellectual disability. Now, ecological inventories, you would do those with individuals of all different types, but certainly individuals who are low functioning, and you would need more information about how to program for those students. And the self-determination scales are certainly things you're going to be doing with individuals who need some special programming for their post-secondary goals. And this key phrase here, nothing about me without me, we heard that in some of the videos that we looked at, and you'll see that as a common refrain throughout the semester about individuals who need assistance in planning for their future, but certainly need to be included in that planning. So how can we incorporate quality of life and self-determination into the IEP process? And this is a question that we will ask ourselves all semester, but I want you to be thinking about it with the video that we saw last week about quality of life, and then some of the things that we've seen this week about self-determination. And we don't have to answer that right now, but I want you to be thinking about it and let it just kind of continue to run as a theme all semester about how we can incorporate these issues into everything that we do with students who have severe disabilities, significant disabilities, and make those sort of the focus of the whole IEP process, because that should be basically the goal that we're going for, is quality of life and self-determination as our outcomes that we're looking for. And somewhere in there, I was going to talk about our can y'all see that? Are you still seeing the, okay, I think I need to go and share screen again. Okay, I want to talk about the choice assignments for just a second, okay? Now, can you see choice assignment A? Okay. I want to look at this for just a minute so you can sort of start thinking about it. All right, choice assignment A that we'll start working on next week, and I believe it's due the following week. You get to pick one of two, choice assignment A or choice assignment B. Now here's choice assignment A. The purpose of the assignment is to give you an opportunity to develop an instructional materials, to develop some instructional materials for supporting student learning within an educational setting. It's oftentimes necessary to adapt instruction for students according to their individual needs. And one common way to adapt instruction is to create instructional materials that support or scaffold the student's learning. And for this assignment, you'll identify a specific skill to be taught, identify a specific learning deficit that would impede a student's acquisition of the identified skill, create materials designed to scaffold and support the student's learning, and give an explanation of the instructional materials along with the demonstration on a video of how it's to be used. So you would design all of that and then complete a video to demonstrate it. So the steps in the assignment: identify a specific skill. It can be academic or behavioral that you'll likely be teaching in your future classroom, or if you're not planning to be a teacher, something that you can imagine that you would help someone with. Consider the disability types that we've studied in the course. Choose a disability type and consider the various ways that it would likely impede the learning of the skill you identified in step 1. Create simple, original, and durable instructional materials for the purpose of addressing the learning difficulty caused by the disability. And then create a 2-minute video demonstrating the use of your instructional materials. So you'll identify the knowledge and skill you're addressing with your instruction. You'll identify the disability type and how it would impede the learning. Introduce your instructional materials and explain how you would use them to address the student's difficulty, and demonstrate how the learning materials work to support or scaffold student learning. And then you'll upload a picture of the learning materials along with a written paragraph for each of the steps and a video of your instructional demonstration. And then here is the rubric that'll be used for scoring. Okay, so that's option 1. So let's look at option 2, or B, choice assignment B. And this is called a life skills infusion assignment. The assignment is based on the idea that students with significant needs in terms of their disability, let's see, those who are working to learn life skills can access the general education curriculum with their peers and work towards mastery of their IEP goals through the process of infusing their goals into assignments within inclusive instructional settings. You're presented with a middle school student, Susan, who joins her typical peers within an inclusive setting for 2 periods a day, art and PE. Use Susan's IEP goals and class lessons for art and PE to develop adapted, aligned activities and assessments. So read Susan's IEP goals and the general education classroom assignments, and those are here below. Determine which IEP goals can be infused into each of the assignments, and devise an activity or adaptations to the existing classroom activity for each class lesson that you could recommend using consultative collaboration to the general education teachers, and that would allow Jill to participate while working toward mastery of her IEP goals. Place your information in a planning matrix such as the example matrix you see below, and elaborate 3 to 4 pages, not 34 pages, 3 to 4 pages on your choice of activities and assessments. Note that more than one of Susan's goals may apply to each general education lesson. As an example, suppose a student had the following IEP goals. And then 1, given a list, be able to follow a short sequence of steps, planning and preparing a meal, 80% of opportunities. Shown video scenarios, be able to identify and practice behaviors that help one to get along with others in a diverse society, 80% of opportunities. When presented with a checklist and visual supports, clean a designated area, 80% of opportunities. Suppose this example student is included in 6th grade general education science class, where the assignment is to work with peers to create mixtures using various substances, noting the characteristics of each resulting mixture. The infusion of her goal number 3 might look something like this. And you see it there. So down here you see Susan's IEP goals, and you see general classroom activities. And here's what you're to turn in: a 3 to 4 page double-spaced elaboration of your choice of activities and assessments, how Susan's IEP goals fit with general education lesson, and how Susan will participate in the gen ed lesson, and how you'll measure progress toward her IEP goals. And then a copy of the infusion planning matrix. And then there's the rubric. Okay, questions? You've got a number of days to think about it, to mull over it. I don't think this is due until week after next, if I'm correct. Any questions?
Does it tell us on scenario B, does it tell us what her disability is? Or just the goals?
No, just the goals.
So do we state what the disability is? Because
I don't think you have to state it. I
But
think
do-
you can assume that it's a significant
the
disability.
disability, okay.
And you'll need to let me know which one of those you choose by early next week. Okay, so think about it and pick one. Any other questions? Y'all have been at it now with me for about an hour. So if we don't have any questions, I'm going to turn you loose. Anybody?
So just one last question. The discussion board, the main one is due tonight, right? Is the
Yes.
main topic essay? Okay.
Yeah, is
Okay.
that Jennifer I'm talking to now?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, I turned on my video.
Yeah. Your first post is due tonight. Uh-huh.
Okay.
And then your responses to other people by Sunday. Okay?
Okay.
Any other
Cool.
questions?
I have a question. I don't want to feel like I'm rushing, but how long does it normally take to get the assignments graded?
I think I will probably have the Unit 1 assignments graded by this weekend.
Okay.
That's my goal.
Just one of those people that the sooner I know the grade, then I know if I've been on the right track as far
I
as
understand. So you'll
for
see if
assignments.
you're doing what's expected of you. Yeah, I'm gonna get after those, and hopefully by the weekend I'll have all of Unit 1 done. Okay?
Sounds great. Thank you.
That's my goal. Anybody else? Okay, we'll do this again next Wednesday for anybody that's interested, and if not, just check on the webinar after Wednesday. Okay?
Awesome.
All right.
Okay.
Thank you.
Nice
Sounds
to
good.
see y'all. Take care.
Thank
And if
you.
you have other questions, just shoot me an email or
Okay.
give me a call, okay?
Dr.
All right.
Kevin, yeah, can I talk to you for a second after everybody hangs up?
Yeah. All
Okay.
right. We'll see y'all.
Bye.
So,
Bye.
Quinn. So,
Okay.
hey, I was,
Teresa, hang on. Let me stop the
Okay.
video, okay?
oh, yes.
Hang on.